All right, so as Stephanie said, I'm Hannah Fordice, and I run House of Faith and Freedom. This organization was really birthed out of my work in advocacy and just consistently hearing these messages over time from victims and survivors about negative impacts or interactions that they had had with the church. I grew up as a pastor's kid. My dad was a church planter. And so I have an enormous heart for the church. And I also recognize that the church has a unique role to fill in support. But it wasn't being filled. And so every day I was training community members in how to provide advocacy services. I was running a 24-hour crisis line and providing court advocacy trainings. And I thought, why can we not bring this type of training into the church? So that is what I'm working on doing. As you can probably tell from the title of this breakout session, we're going to be looking at the intersection of domestic abuse, trafficking, and exploitation. I do want to just take a quick side note to say that I may interchangeably use the terms domestic abuse, domestic violence, or intimate partner violence. For our purposes, they all mean the same thing, which is confusing, but people in the advocacy field just love to have a lot of terms. I'll try to stick to domestic abuse most of the time. All right. So in the advocacy world, we have this tendency to focus on individual issues or behaviors. We specialize in anti-trafficking, like many of you here, or in domestic violence, like me, or maybe in sexual assault advocacy, or mental health work, or addiction recovery. And I kind of like to think of these silos or containers around particular issues as like a spice container. We're all sort of working in the same field with the same types of things, the same types of traumas. They may be sitting next to one another or, sort of be in the same proverbial spice cabinet. But we treat them separately, and we often treat them one at a time. One trauma at a time, one situation at a time, and one issue at a time. But as I'm sure you know, life does not happen in perfect little containers or silos, and trauma definitely doesn't either. It's a lot more like an Italian seasoning. It's everything all mixed together. It's our experiences and our traumas and our relationships and our losses and our struggles, and they're all combined and mixed up and intermingled until we can't really separate them anymore. Early on in my career, when I was interning in a domestic violence advocacy agency, I had a woman come in who was seeking advocacy around domestic violence. It just so happened that she had also gone through a recent sexual assault and had sought services from the local agency that dealt with sexual assault advocacy. It's not that uncommon for domestic violence and sexual assault to kind of go hand in hand. And so when she had a court hearing for her rape, she had asked if I would be able to come and support her at the hearing as a court advocate. When I went and asked my supervisor if I could get approval to go to this hearing, I was told that I shouldn't go because someone at the sexual assault agency was already going, and that was their territory. That was their issue. They were the ones who were going to deal with it, so I shouldn't try to step on their toes by showing up. This was incredibly frustrating, and I can't imagine how much more frustrating for this woman. Her life, if I'm really pulling this analogy of spices, probably past where I should, but it was like a bowl of pasta that someone had dumped an entire container of Italian seasoning on. She had a ton of different traumas that she was undergoing. And instead of receiving help, she was stuck in the middle of these two different agencies that were saying, well, we only deal with oregano, or we only deal with the basil, but no one was helping her with the entire mess of it. Instead, they were sitting there inspecting the tiny pieces of her life and trying to decide which piece belonged in whose jurisdiction. They weren't playing well together, and the person who suffered from that was the victim. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong to have a specialization. I'm up here speaking really from my perspective as someone who works primarily in domestic violence. A lot of times we need to have specializations in order to really understand the nuance of a particular issue. However, we can't become blinded to the rest of the spice mix and the impact that it's having on the flavor of the dish. We can't become blinded to the various types of trauma that someone undergoes and the resulting effects on the entire person. We must learn to see and to understand the complexity of trauma and the complexity of life and of love and of loss. We must come to see people as a whole and not just as a part. As advocates, supporters, survivors, and helpers, all of the people who are in this room today, we have to learn not only what our roles look like, but also what kind of relationships we can cultivate with others in order to provide this sort of holistic support throughout the entirety of someone's trauma and healing process. Which is also incidentally why I think Mobilize Minnesota is such a cool initiative, because it's combining all of these different agencies that no longer want to compete for services, they want to combine services. But before we can really get into kind of the whole of the Italian seasoning mix here, let's talk about the various components. So what is domestic abuse or domestic violence? The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence defines it as the willful intimidation, physical assault, battery, sexual assault, and/or other abusive behaviors as a part of a systematic pattern of power and control perpetrated by one intimate partner against another. Also, it can be previous intimate partner as well. It doesn't have to be current. This view of domestic violence as not just a cycle of physical abuse or physical battering, but really is this much broader set of behaviors that are used to create a power differential between two people, was originally developed in the 1980s by a group called the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project, or DAIP. It's known as the Duluth model because Duluth is where DAIP is located, and it's used globally as a way of describing and understanding abuse. One way to really sum up the Duluth model is something called the power and control wheel. And I'm sure many of you have probably seen this wheel before. It's very commonly used in the advocacy world. And it was originally created by a focus group of women from DAIP. And their experiences with domestic violence have resonated with women across the globe. The way that I like to think of the power and control wheel is like an apple. I didn't just put that up there because I like food references. But I do realize I'm using a lot of them. Anyway, I like to think of it like an apple. The physical or sexual violence is sort of this visible outer layer. But just beneath the surface, there's this much broader set of behaviors and tactics that are used to support this outer layer of visible violence, and also which kind of make up the bulk of the relationship issues. And then at that very core, the seed that grew the fruit of abuse is power and control. Prior to the Duluth model, a relationship wasn't really considered abusive unless it was full of multiple instances of physical or sexual violence. That would be things like slapping, punching, strangling, hitting with objects, threatening with a weapon. This isn't to say that this type of violence isn't common today and still very significant. It is. I'm sure most of the people in this room know someone who has been diagnosed with cancer at some point in their life. Turns out that the lifetime prevalence of physical violence is within 3% of the lifetime prevalence of cancer. So if you know someone who's had cancer, you know someone who's been in a physically violent relationship. On a national level, those numbers come out as 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men for physical violence, rape, or stalking. 30% of women in the US have been slapped, pushed, or shoved by an intimate partner. 14% have been punched or hit with something hard. A further 11% have been severely beaten. 10% have been choked or suffocated. And I know here today we're really focusing on youth. So if we look at teen dating relationships, 1 in 5 high school girls and 1 in 7 high school boys have been physically or sexually abused by a dating partner. If we move beyond physical abuse into mental, emotional, into manipulation, coercion, things like that, we're up to 50% of both women and men have undergone some form of intimate partner violence. I want to take a second and just note how insane those numbers are, because they are wild. Like half of the population has been in some form of intimate partner violence or domestic violence. That is very large. It is all over our communities. It is all over our churches, our schools. And domestic abuse, incidentally, is one of the huge risk factors for trafficking and exploitation. It really lays the groundwork. So what is trafficking? I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because we've already heard 2 awesome talks that really describe trafficking and exploitation very well, but namely there's sex trafficking or labor trafficking. And these are kind of the 2 primary camps that tend to exist. In addition, sexual exploitation is sort of that maybe fudgier in-between area where it can be for personal gain, not just the third-party trafficker. It can include profiting off money, socially profiting, politically profiting, or any other form of value that someone could be getting out of sexual exploitation. Here is a modified version of the power and control wheel for trafficking. And you may notice it looks shockingly like the original power and control wheel. Besides just the fact that the shape is the same, almost every single spoke of this wheel, or of the sort of the white part of the apple, is almost exactly the same. And at the center, again, we see power and control. The only thing that really shifted here is that the trafficking is what's moved to the outside. The overlap between trafficking and exploitation and domestic violence is very, very large. Many different issues may intersect or co-occur with trafficking. We heard a lot about that earlier today, things like addiction, mental health, trauma. But trafficking and domestic violence are particularly tied. They show up together a lot. They might be a bit like that oregano and basil. They can exist separately, but where the presence of one is, there's a greater likelihood of the presence of the other. They can exist, the main reason for this is the core cause, that power and control. It's the same. And also the core tactics are also the same. Manipulation, physical force, financial control, sexual assault, isolation. The primary difference between the 2 is going to be the profit or benefit to the person in power, which would make it more in trafficking, whereas with domestic violence, it tends to remain within the confines of the family system or the relationship. And usually the offender in these situations is using the abuse as a personal capacity to maintain kind of the upper hand in the relationship or in order to just mistreat their partner. Because of their similarities, domestic abuse and exploitation or trafficking can be mixed together in these very complex and interesting ways. Domestic abuse itself is a risk factor for exploitation and trafficking. Although anyone can be trafficked or exploited, we saw that earlier as well, there are certain risk factors that increase the vulnerability of someone and thus their chance of being exploited. According to Psychology Today, 70% of adult female trafficking victims went through domestic violence before they were trafficked. That's a big number. That's almost 3/4. Domestic abuse lays the groundwork for exploitation because it systematically strips away someone's identity and choice and power. That said, the increased risk of exploitation to domestic abuse victims or survivors results not only from the abuse itself, but also from the incredibly unstable home environment that it creates. For example, even if a child or a teen is not being directly abused themselves, if they're in a home where there's intimate partner violence going on, they're at a higher risk of being trafficked. According to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, over half of prostituted women were initially runaway youth. Similarly, those who were found to be vulnerable to trafficking often had experienced their own forms of domestic or sexual abuse, were in the child welfare system, had a parent with substance abuse issues, or were facing some form of economic need. Another study conducted by Thorne in 2020 on minor sex trafficking victims found that over a third had emotionally abusive parents, another third had physically abusive parents, and roughly a fourth had sexually abusive parents. Which is kind of a great segue into the fact that domestic abuse itself can actually lead to trafficking, not just as a risk factor, but as an actual cause. Many traffickers are romantic partners. This would be kind of the Romeos that we were talking about in the last session. And they can progress from domestic abuse into forcing their victim to perform sexual favors or services or labor of some kind for a profit or a gain. According to the FBI, this is the less than 10% of people are kidnapped into trafficking. The rest are exploited by someone that they knew. The trust was already there, and many times the power dynamics and the power differential was already there as well. It just gets leveraged into trafficking. On the flip side, trafficking can lead to domestic abuse. The number one path into trafficking and exploitation is relationships. Traffickers groom their victims into trusting them, into believing that they are a safe person who cares about them deeply, especially in the form of romantic relationships. The trafficker then uses this emotional bond as a form of manipulation, coercion, and exploitation. That same 2020 Thorne study found that 88% of respondents said that their trafficker had told them that they would take care of them, and 73% had had their trafficker tell them that they loved them. That's almost 3/4 of victims who believed that their trafficker loved them. Now pair that with the fact that well over half of trafficked individuals are subject to physical abuse at the hands of their traffickers, and we begin to see how often trafficking and domestic abuse occur together. Two of the particular mixes here that we often see between domestic abuse and exploitation is sextortion and sugaring. Sugaring was mentioned really briefly a little bit earlier, and it might get touched on more later today, but I won't spend a ton of time, but I do feel like I should at least mention them because there are these sort of interesting, fudgy middle layers that land very clearly between domestic abuse and exploitation, or kind of in that overlap. Sexting. Ooh, that's weird. My G ended up in the bottom. Sounds like I'm cool. Sexting. Anyway, sorry. Sextortion often starts with sexting. This is the sharing of sexually explicit or compromising digital media. A 2020 study found that over a third of teens believe that sharing nudes with their peers is normal, and 1 in 4 have shared their own nudes. That's frightening. Of those, 41% shared their nudes with someone who is 18 years or older. The sharing of explicit or nude photos or videos of minors is already considered self-generated child sexual abuse material. It is illegal, even if they're sending it to someone their own age. But the fact that it's normalized within the context of culture and within real life and digital relationships sort of lays this perfect, rich foundation for exploitation to occur. As we all know, once that content is shared digitally, it's never going away. It's going to be somewhere in the digital world, and that means that it's open for the exploitation. 31% of 13 to 17-year-olds and 17% of 9 to 12-year-olds said that they have seen non-consensually or reshared nude photos or videos of someone from their school or their local community, which leads us to sextortion. Sextortion is a form of sexual exploitation where the offender possesses sexual or revealing digital material, often images or videos, of the victim and threatens to release them if the victim doesn't do what they say. That might be additional sexual favors, it could be more images or videos, or it could be money. Sextortion often happens to preteens and teens. In fact, a 2017 study found that 1 in 4 sextortion victims were under the age of 13 at the time of the offense. The same study showed that preteen victims were more likely to experience sextortion via online offenders. This is someone who would find them on a social media app or on the internet somewhere. As for the rest, well over half of them had prior romantic relationships with the people who sextorted them. So roughly half of these cases are landing pretty squarely in also the domestic abuse realm because it was a former or current romantic partner. These abusers will often use sextortion as a means of getting back at their ex or of preventing them from breaking up with them or for some other form of profit. Which moves us into sugaring or sugar dating. These are real ads on the right-hand side for sugar dating websites. The National Center on Exploitation defines sugaring as wealthy individuals who tend to be male, using cash, lavish gifts, and/or help with debt as a means to facilitate and stimulate their demand for sex and intimacy via less than wealthy individuals that tend to be younger and female. AKA, it's rich, older individuals, often white men, who have an intimate relationship with someone young, often in college, who's financially struggling from debt or living away from their parents for the first time or looking for the leg up in the career field, and they're paying them for that sexual relationship or intimate relationship. The advertising done by sugaring apps reminds me a lot of how cigarettes were marketed in the 90s. Right? When tobacco companies kind of created this bright colored packaging and different flavored tobacco, and they used like cartoon characters in order to really appeal to these younger generation and kind of make it seem like a cool, edgy thing to be doing. Similarly, sugaring is often presented in advertising as sort of this fun, sexy, stress-free, glamorous way to make money, get out of debt, network, and get ahead in your career field with someone who's already been successful. And it's gained enormous popularity among college students over the last few years. The sugar dating app, Seeking Arrangements, it has a couple of ads up there, is one of the largest. And in 2020, Georgia State University said that they had 1,500 students who had signed up for Seeking Arrangements accounts with their student emails. Which is just wild. So there's probably way more than 1,500 students that have signed up. In fact, Georgia State University also claims that roughly 40% of sugar babies are in college, and the average age of sugar daddies is 45. That means there's a 1 to 2 decade age gap in the vast majority of sugaring cases. Although that age gap isn't technically illegal if both people are over the age of 18, it should be pretty unnerving. And although sugar dating can be consensual, the entire framework is really set up perfectly to promote violence and manipulation and coercion and exploitation. First of all, that's because sugaring targets an already vulnerable and at-risk population. Those who are lower income, who are young, who are living on their own, who maybe come from difficult home lives. And sugar daddies are looking for that person that they can lure in with financial security or gifts or intimacy. That same tactic, incidentally, is used by a lot of domestic abusers. They do what's called love bombing. This is where one partner is going to shower the other with attention and gifts and money and all of this love and flattery in order to gain a sense of power. And it also facilitates the type of relationship where the victim is dependent on the abuser or the sugar daddy, and where their life becomes increasingly isolated from other forms of independence or relationships. Not only do love bombing, especially when it's literally inherent in the system, like sugaring is built on love bombing, it sets up a dangerous power differential between the partners. And that's something that's a key factor in both domestic abuse and in trafficking and exploitation. If you remember back to the power and control wheel, that core was power and control. And not only do age and wealth and gender in the case of male sugar daddies and an established, often high power career give a power advantage to the sugar daddy, but also sugar babies are often given monthly stipends or allowances. They may have their debt paid off by the sugar daddy. They could be considered newly indebted then to that individual or person. This gives the sugar daddy in the relationship an enormous amount of power. In fact, it gives them almost all of the power. From here, it's a very short jump to abuse and exploitation. Whether that would be the sugar daddy pressuring or coercing or threatening their partner for sex or for sexual favors they're not comfortable giving, causing verbally abusive comments or using physical violence. Another interesting facet of sugar dating is that the sugar baby's body, appearance, or company is inherently treated as a commodity. It's something that's up for sale. As soon as we view people as a product or an object, we move away from relationship and into the realm of ownership. As in, I, the sugar daddy, now own your body or your time because I paid for it, and so I can do whatever I want. And finally, sugaring websites and apps are the perfect hunting ground for traffickers. It is a group of people who are literally saying, I am looking for money and for stability in someone else. And so they're a great place that a lot of traffickers do go in order to find victims. When someone experiences abuse or trafficking or exploitation, or some mix maybe of all of the above, they undergo what's called complex trauma. This is a type of trauma that occurs repeatedly and cumulatively over a period of time and within certain relationships or contexts. In his book, The Child Safeguarding Policy Guide for Churches and Ministries, which is excellent, by the way, and I can definitely point any of you in the direction of it after this, Basil talks about how our souls are like wet cement. The trauma and abuse, especially ongoing and repeated trauma, that occurs early on in our lives leaves an imprint, and as we age, that imprint hardens. The imprint can be worn down over time, but it can never fully be erased. It creates this lasting impact in nearly every area of our life: emotional, behavioral, psychological, and spiritual. Complex trauma increases the risk of developing anxiety, OCD, disassociation, substance abuse, suicidal ideation. If you're curious about complex trauma and its long-lasting effects, you could just take a look at the ACEs study. Those with one or more adverse childhood experiences are at a significantly increased risk of developing various health issues throughout their entire life, not just limited to mental health. Things like heart disease, liver disease, lung disease, cancer. Also things like homelessness, addiction, impaired job functioning. All of these things, incidentally, are also risk factors for further abuse, traumatization, and exploitation. The reality is that complex trauma results in complex needs, and that the impression made by the trauma, it never really goes away. The healing will take years, and even then, it'll still leave a mark. In fact, the healing will never stop until we're on the other side of eternity. The impact of exploitation and abuse is long-term, and the support really needs to be equally so. Most government and nonprofit agencies are set up to offer immediate help. They're the triage or the field medicine. They're the ones out there putting on tourniquets for hemorrhaging wounds. They are on the front line offering emergency services and resources and legal advocacy and financial aid and housing assistance, and maybe even some support for the first few months or years. But really, no agency or organization has the money or the manpower to truly support a victim through the lifelong work of healing and regrowth. This is where the role of the church comes in. Throughout my career, one of the things that I repeatedly noticed was the absence of the church in the world of advocacy. And it was something that really broke my heart. It's what drove me to start House of Faith and Freedom in the first place. Because the truth is, the church has something really unique to offer. Those nonprofits and agencies who are out supporting survivors through day one and through year one and through year two, they can't support them forever. Luckily, there is a group of people who make living in a community, serving and supporting a way of life. The church. The church is an incredible and sustainable solution for long-term care and support. I've had the incredible pleasure of seeing this happen myself with my own church growing up. I watched our congregation rise up around a woman and her children who had been abused for years by a spouse. And the care of the body of Christ never stopped. It's still going on today, almost 10 years later. The same people who went to her court hearings are still who spend holidays with her. And she still hangs out with them and gets support from them. And it's part of what inspired me to pursue advocacy in the first place, was watching that life-on-life type of support that was deep and long-term and wasn't just for like today or tomorrow. Yet I also watched my church struggle their way through that process. None of them really had experience advocating with abuse victims before. The process was long and complex, and it was difficult, and that too was a part of what inspired me to start House of Faith and Freedom. I wanted to equip them so that when someone did come forward, it wasn't just long-term support, it was educated support. So, what can I tell you in this one short 50-minute breakout session that will help you get out of the confusing and misty and kind of muddled world of wanting to help but not really knowing how to? What should the response of the church be, and of the community be, and of the school system be? And one of the simplest ways that I found is using an image that most of you have seen if you took any kind of psychology course in college. And I use it as a bit of a help guide. In the mid-20th century, a chap named Abraham Maslow developed a psychological theory called the hierarchy of needs. It looks very much like the food pyramid. Again, me and food, it's a thing. Maslow theorized that there are 5 basic human needs that everyone has, and that these needs can be ranked in sort of a general sense by their level of priority. The most basic human need is physical need. That would be things like food, housing, clothing. These particular things, we need them to survive. You will not live if you do not have food and water and some degree of shelter. Next, we have safety, and then after that, social or belonging, and then esteem, and then self-actualization. Something, interestingly enough, between safety and physical need is if physical need is our most basic and motivated need, and if that need is not met, safety is like a second priority. So this is why a lot of people do tend to stay in domestic abuse relationships. It's obviously not that simple. There's a lot of reasons why, but physical need is a big one. So housing, finances, food, similar with trafficking. It's hard to want to leave when you think you're going to starve or you have nowhere to go. In addition to kind of its traditional application of maybe just learning basically about human needs in college, we can look at Maslow's model as an organizing principle for areas where sort of the local church or community can support victims and survivors. So in the physical world, this would be things like supporting local shelters or affordable housing. This could be things like fundraisers for agencies that are doing that frontline work. It could be financial assistance or keeping gas and gift cards on hand for people's tangible needs. If we move up into safety, that would be things like having hotel vouchers for emergency overnight stays. Again, knowing your local shelters and supporting them with whatever their needs are. It could be offering old cell phones to victims and survivors. If you didn't know, any old cell phone you have, if it turns on, you can dial 911 on it, and it'll work. So those are great to hand out to survivors or to victims when they're in risky situations. A lot of times the phone is the first thing to be broken or thrown away. It could also be having crisis line numbers listed on sheets that you post in public areas or in your restrooms, or building policies or safety protocols around child abuse and neglect, especially for churches, which that safeguarding policy I mentioned earlier for is fabulous at. Next, we have social or belonging. This would be the community aspect. And this is something that's a really fascinating one to me because a lot of people, especially in abusive relationships or sometimes in trafficking, when they've had a really long-term relationship with their trafficker, that is their community now. They have been so isolated and pushed away from everybody else in their life. That person makes up their world. So when they leave, there's nobody else there. It's vital that we have things in place, support systems in place, communities in place, so that when survivors get out, they have people who are there for them to support them both emotionally, but also with all of these other needs. I think in a church context, we have a really interesting opportunity to help meet that social or belonging need because of the community aspect of it. Then we have esteem. This would be things like self-esteem. This is an interesting one because abuse slowly strips away somebody's identity. It tells them that they're worthless. It tells them that they're not smart enough, that they're not good enough, that they don't deserve respect. Lies like these are really hard to combat. And to do so takes time, and it takes a lot of reinforcement of truth. This is one of the really important things, too, that faith communities or other community groups, schools can do, is speaking the value of survivors back to them. This is saying that you are loved and you are known and you are worthy and you can come back from this and you are cherished and irreplaceable. And that has an enormous amount of impact that we can't underestimate. And finally, we have self-actualization. This would be, where do we find meaning in life? What is our purpose? I think a lot of us struggle with this one, even in our own lives right now. Who am I? What am I supposed to be doing? What's my calling? Helping a survivor or a victim to find the things that they're passionate about and that they're good at is incredibly empowering. It's part of showing them that they have a reason to be here. As a Christ follower, I would say all of us have a purpose to love God and to love others. And this is something that we can definitely provide in a church setting, but also I think there's the opportunity through volunteer options, whether in a church or in a nonprofit or in a community setting, to allow victims in a safe place to begin to put dip their toe in the water, if you will, into different types of leadership positions, volunteer positions, where they can try out different things and find their giftings and their talents and their strengths, and it's not attached to their trauma. But of course, this here, Maslow's hierarchy, is really just a framework of ideas. And complex trauma is, well, it's complex. There are going to be times, in fact, I would argue, elements or areas in literally every single case you will ever come across that you will not be the best prepared person to help with. In cases like these, it's essential that you have an established network, that you have a community of organizations and individuals who are trained in their own little spice containers, if you will. This is part of not getting caught up in the jurisdiction battle that I mentioned at the start of this talk, but instead working together to truly help victims work through their trauma and find long-term healing. Creating a network, the two big things that I would say are, in a nutshell, gather information and then begin to build those partnerships. Start by literally Googling. Just Google every agency or resource in your area that offers domestic violence and trafficking resources, that offers financial aid, that offers substance abuse treatment, and on and on. And once you have this great compiled list of what's available, not only can you refer people to those agencies, but you also have a place to start building your partnerships or your relationships. I would suggest just going down the list and calling everybody on it. I am yet to have an agency that wasn't willing to open their doors or to talk with me about someone who wanted to help. All of us are looking for help. So call them and ask the questions, find out who they serve, find out what they do, what are their needs, how can you support them, whether that's in your church community or your school. And then finally, ask them in. Be the first one to open the door. Invite them to come into your space, into your group, into your area and sphere of influence, and share what they do. And a lot of times that's going to open the door the other way as well. And then we need to talk about prevention because, like it was mentioned earlier, really prevention is how we get ahead of it. This is the best thing that we can do, is that hopefully we never have to deal with the response issue. The first thing I would say is talk about healthy relationships and intimacy and consent with your kids and teens and nieces and nephews and youth groups. If you don't talk with them, the world will. And culture is a very bad teacher on relationships. One of the stories I do not tell very often is that when I was 15, I dated a boy who was from a local church. And he was extremely mentally and emotionally abusive and very manipulative. And during that time period, I didn't know how to talk to my parents. Even though I had a good relationship with them, I didn't know how to bring it up. I was embarrassed about it. I was uncomfortable. I wasn't even sure what I was going through because we'd never really talked about what unhealthy relationships looked like. But thankfully, I had a mentor in my life. It was a family friend of ours who went out for coffee with me every other week. And we would just talk about life. But she consistently opened that door for me to talk about my relationship, for me to talk about dating. And it's part of the reason that I got out of it, because I had somewhere safe to go. We can't underestimate the power of that. During interviews with trafficking survivors from a 2012 report conducted by the Sex Workers Project, 2/3 of survivors mentioned the importance of open communication with parents and guardians. They expressed that they could have avoided or got out of a trafficking situation if they would have had more open communication with their families and more knowledge about the world in general. Helena, one of the survivors, said, "I really think the best thing is to communicate. The parents, they have to talk with their kids, even when they're 10, 11, 15, about drugs, sex, and all that stuff. My parents didn't talk with us about those things. I think it's very important to speak with them about everything, to let them know that there are bad people outside, to give them signs, to let them learn how to recognize behaviors about somebody that is approaching you with some other type of intention." We can't underestimate the power of open communication and of trust and of being a safe space for teens and for youth to talk. If you have kids, start the conversation now. Open the door. If you're a youth leader, bring in this conversation about abusive or unhealthy relationships to your youth group. Talk about what consent looks like. Talk about what boundaries are and how they can be healthy. If you don't have kids, be a mentor to a kid. That was who was helpful to me. Be the safe adult for your niece or your nephew or for your friends' kids. The next thing is be aware of abusive behaviors and recruiting tactics. Culture idolizes unhealthy relationships. I grew up in the era of Twilight. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that book series, but it was really creepy. But I loved it in high school. Like in middle school and high school, I loved it. I went to all the midnight showings of the movies, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's so romantic. He's just obsessed with her, right? And I thought that was cool. Like, it was very interesting. But the truth is that obsession often masquerades as passion. And love bombing masquerades as caring. And stalking and jealousy masquerade as protectiveness. Get your youth and your teens and yourself educated on the types of behaviors that are red flags for abuse and for exploitation. This would be things like friends or connections made solely online, overwhelming, fast-moving, over-the-top, passionate relationships. Things like stalking or tracking or monitoring behaviors. I'm talking about like Snapchat and the Find Your Friends on there. There are a lot of great trainings that you can bring into your community, school, church. Many of them are here today. So there's the Youth Aware training from a.c.t.united, Not a Number from Love 146, Power Over Predators from CAST, the Value Project from Childhood Victories, and I offer victim advocacy trainings for your churches as well. This leads us into online and app safety. This is a big one. If you remember in that sort of pre-teen era that I was talking about earlier, the vast majority of people between the ages of 9 and 13 that were trafficked or exploited had met their trafficker online. When I was younger and in that very unhealthy and abusive relationship, we had dial-up internet. And so I had a landline phone, so my parents knew when I was on the phone and they could restrict it. They also knew when I was online because it was blocking the phone. They could restrict it. And then when I did get a cell phone, I had roughly 50 text messages a month with like 250 characters. So there was not a lot of like online conversations happening with the person that I was in a relationship with. And I'm really thankful for that. I don't think apps even existed. There definitely wasn't internet access on my phone. Technology today, though, offers this really unprecedented access to young people and to the world. And it also offers the other way around, the world unprecedented access to your youth. Earlier we talked about, the many traffickers or exploiters or abusive relationships that people meet online. It's often through things like Snapchat or through other apps like Instagram, Facebook. There are several very interesting studies put out by Thorne that talk about the different platforms that people met their traffickers on. The fact is it can happen in these really wide open places that a lot of youth are already engaging. And technology is part of what exposes them. So there's a lot of practical value you can get from teaching your kids about online safety. They may roll your eyes at you and feel like this is ridiculous, I know how to be safe online. But it's better to talk to them about it early on and teach them what it looks like to be safe. This would be things like, remember that nothing sent electronically ever disappears. Don't send nudes. Like, it's illegal. But also, it never goes away. Set your privacy settings to maximum. Have parental controls for younger kids. Limit the personal information that you post online. Also, keep your GPS location turned off in apps. I think a lot of kids don't really think about that, but you can literally be tracked all the time through certain apps. Again, Snapchat would be one of those. Also be skeptical. Just have an innate skepticism about the people you're meeting online. a.c.t.united does offer that online safety program. This could be a great thing to bring into your school, church, community, sphere of influence to learn a little bit more about app safety. And then finally, use your voice. Awareness is the first step of prevention. Awareness drives culture change, it drives education, it drives action. Each of you has shown that you care about these issues because you came here today. Each of you has shown that there is more to be done and that you realize that. Don't let it end here. Use your platform, use your pulpit, use your influence and your friend groups as places to speak about abuse and about extortion. Get more training, build up your relationships with community agencies, and learn to have really uncomfortable conversations because it is uncomfortable. It's not like these are popular topics that are, great to sit over coffee and chat with someone about, but they're super important and they can save somebody's life. Learn that none of us can end abuse and exploitation or trafficking on our own, but together we truly can, and each of us has a role to play in that.